Thank you to everyone for coming to join today's webinar. It's taking place in the context of the Global Week of Action for Climate Finance and a Fossil-Free Future. And today, Monday, September 16th, is our Tax Justice Day. So we're having this webinar on the interconnectedness of climate and tax justice. And I'm very excited to have our four amazing panelists here who will be sharing more on this. So maybe I'll just jump right into everyone's introductions. First, we have on my right, we have Lidy Nacpil, who is a feminist activist working on economic, environmental, social, and gender justice issues in national, regional, and global campaigns. She's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and one of the founders of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, and the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. There's a lot of knowledge on the intersections between the climate justice and tax justice already. Lidy is also part of the steering committee of the Asia Energy Network and the Civil Society Equity Review Network and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. She serves as the chairperson of the Orang Women's Movement and of Sankalas Movement based in the Philippines. So thank you very much, Lidy, for joining today. I'm looking forward to hearing your intervention. Now I'll introduce Carola Mejía, who's a Bolivian economist with a master's degree in economics of development with a specialty in sustainable development and environment from the Institute of Social Studies in Holland. She has more than 15 years of experience as an advisor and consultant to public, private, and international cooperation organizations, providing technical support to environmental projects and working on issues related to climate change, sustainable development, climate finance, and climate justice. She worked as a climate finance analyst for 3 years in the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, or Latindadd, and this year is the coordinator of the area of climate justice, transitions, and the Amazon at Latindadd. So thank you, Carola, for joining. And next we have Salman Mwampikita, who's the lead researcher in climate and environment at the Center for Trade Policy and Development, CTPD, and lecturer at the NIPA. He holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from the University of Zambia and a Master of Science in Water Management and Governance from the IHE Institute for Water Education with interest in climate finance and adaptation and indigenous knowledge. And last but not least is Markus Trilling, who's the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Eurodad, the European Network on Debt and Development. He works on Eurodad's tax justice team, where he carries out research and analysis on progressive green taxation. Markus has a decades-long history of campaigning in Brussels with environmental NGO networks on EU fiscal policies and holds advanced degrees in economic, social, and political sciences. So thank you to all four panelists for being here. I think there's a lot of exciting knowledge that we can delve into today. So let's just jump in. Lidy, maybe it'd be great to hear a bit about your experience working in the climate justice and tax justice movements and how these really intersect, how tax justice can deliver on really key asks of the climate justice movement, such as climate finance, and maybe also what is a global South perspective to these movements and to this work.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. First of all, I'd like to say that there are many, many activists in the Global South who have no choice but to be active in all these issues and to be fighting in many different arenas on different issues. We can't afford to work in silos, just focusing on one issue or the other, because we believe that we need to fight in this many different fronts to actually create and build the world that we need, for justice, for peace, for equality. And now we're in a race to save humanity and the planet from certain catastrophe. Life as we know it on Earth right today will be really profoundly changed unless we stop the climate crisis in its tracks. This week is a global week of action, and it's focusing on two things. One is the call for a rapid, equitable, and just fossil fuel phase out, and the other is a call for the delivery of climate finance, specifically the obligations of the global north of delivering climate finance for the global south. And on these two counts, on these very two issues, tax justice is very fundamental. We need to have not just immediate reforms in the international as well as national tax architecture, but also broad sweeping reforms to transform the system in order that we can address climate change. On immediate tax justice reforms, we're looking at how tax is a very vital source of funds, public funds, so that the global north can deliver their climate finance obligations. Right now, we're in a big fight because the global north has been consistently evading their responsibility in delivering climate finance in full, because their obligations are way, way more than just the trickles of finance that are coming in for the South. And these trickles of climate finance that are coming in are largely, in fact, in the form of loans. About 80% of the small trickles of climate finance are in the form of loans. So we don't really accept the excuse of the global north governments that there's just not enough public funds and therefore we should rely on private finance, and also on raising domestic resources ourselves, the global south, because we believe that they have the power, if they so decide, if they have the political will, to actually first and foremost tax the profiteers and the polluters in their country, their elites and corporations, and they can raise the trillions that are needed for climate finance. But more than just simply new taxes, we also believe that they should stop subsidizing fossil fuel corporations, which is also related to the phase out of fossil fuels demand, because right now there are hundreds of billions of tax subsidies for fossil fuel corporations, subsidies that are in the form of tax incentives. So if they stop doing this, there's more money to be raised or rechanneled, in fact, rather than giving this different kinds of subsidies, including tax subsidies to fossil fuel corporations. More money can be raised so that they can deliver the climate finance in full. But just to say too that tax is not just about these immediate needs for climate finance and also for the push for the fossil fuel phase out. We need many big changes in the international financial tax architecture and the national tax systems in our countries, so that we are able to stop the bleeding and raise enough resources even within our own economies in the South, so that we can address many fundamental needs like public services, economic and social justice policies and programs, and climate action. And these public services and economic and social justice programs are also very much very urgently needed, because these are what makes us even more vulnerable to climate impacts. The fact that our public services are in dire straits, the fact that there is so much inequality in our economic and social systems, and therefore most of our people are just that much more vulnerable to climate impact. So it's not enough to raise money for the loss and damage. We should do all things possible so that we are not so vulnerable to the impacts, and so that we can undertake also the kind of reforms and changes in our economic systems that we need to first reduce and reach zero emissions, and then to build, and also at the same time to build resilience. So I think if that's not there's not enough appreciation, and we should also work hard as tax justice activists. Now I'm talking, work hard to make sure that climate activists realize just how fundamentally important it is to undertake these immediate changes in the tax systems. First, to deliver on climate finance. Second, to reduce our vulnerabilities, to stop our economies from bleeding, and also thirdly, to ensure that we build equitable economic systems that are post-carbon. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that is a really great framing for these issues and why why they're so important to be connecting and the impacts that they really can have when we actualize these demands. So maybe we'll move on to Carola to kind of bring in the perspective of Latin America and what has the experience been there with environmental taxation and how we can ensure that it does support both tax justice and climate justice.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Thank you for joining this webinar. I will build on what Lidy was already mentioning and to mention some figures about the needs of global south countries. According to the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, until 2030, global south countries need around between $5.8 and $5.9 trillion only to fulfill their climate commitments, between 215 and 387 billion annually for adaptation, around 4.3 trillion per year for clean energy, and there is an estimation that loss and damage will cost around 400 billion per year to our countries. So Lidy was mentioning that there are some commitments of the climate debtors, the global north countries that are responsible for the climate emergency. In 2009, they have committed 100 billion annually to global south countries to help us adapt and mitigate climate change. But so far, they haven't fulfilled this goal. And as Lidy was saying, there are a lot of problems regarding this, related to this climate finance. For example, only 24% is going to adaptation, which is a priority for our countries. The mechanisms to access these funds are very complex. The application, for example, for the Green Climate Fund can take up to 5 years for one project to be approved. There are very few direct window access for non-governmental stakeholders. Lidy was mentioning that 72% of public climate finance come in the form of loans for Latin America. That's 81% that is coming as loans that is unfairly increasing our debts. And from this total amount of climate finance, Latin American countries are only receiving 17%. And there is a problem related also to transparency because there is a single methodology or definition agreed about what is climate finance and what should be accounted. So considering all the problems related to the climate finance within the UNFCCC, we think there could be different solutions that could help our countries tackle the climate emergency. For example, debt relief in countries in need, moratorium and debt restructuring for countries that are affected by adverse climate-related events, and immediate access to non-debt generating resources to cover loss and damage. For Latindadd, we are advocating for new allocations of special drawing rights for climate action, but under a different and fair distribution criteria that prioritize climate vulnerability. And we have these tax mechanisms. For example, progressive green taxes, especially to fossil fuel corporations. That will be very helpful considering that 100 fossil fuel producing companies are linked to 71% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions. So they are responsible. We don't have to invite the private sector to invest. We really need to also tax them because they are causing the problem. There's another proposal. For example, the G20 was discussing this proposal in Brazil this year about taxing the wealth, considering that the richest 1% of the world's population generates twice as many emissions as the poorest 50%, as a report of Oxfam estimates. And of course, as Lidy was mentioning, there is a lot of public money, but it's going to sectors that are harming people instead of really helping. So we need to redirect military expenditures, illicit financial flows, and fossil fuel subsidies to climate action. To give you some figures, between 21 and 32 trillion in financial assets are held in tax havens. Every year, 480 billion in taxes are lost due to tax abuse, and global fuel subsidies amounted to 7 trillion in 2022. So there's a lot of money going to the wrong sectors. And if you rechannel this to the climate emergency, we could be responding to the needs. And in Latindadd, we did a report, we did an analysis of green taxes in 5 countries, in Argentina, Mexico, Chile, Costa Rica, and Colombia. And we could analyze what was happening with these green taxes and also with the subsidies in hydrocarbon sector, which are very used in our countries. And we could see that these green taxes emerge as a useful and necessary tool to disincentivize polluting activities, but they are not enough to finance the just energy transition that we are advocating for, especially at the national level. This could be a part, but it's of course not going to be the silver bullet to solve everything. Their weakness comes, as we could see in these 5 countries, particularly from their volatility, since these schemes tend to be modified with rate cuts or inclusion of exemptions when the macroeconomic context becomes complicated to counter variations in inflation and oil prices. That's what we have noticed in Mexico and Argentina. The taxes don't remain the same. They are adjusted considering the economic context. Also, although there is a consensus on their potential to curb climate change, their application faces resistance, especially of governments, countries, and industries that are still investing in traditional and polluting technologies. And what we have also noticed about these 5 countries is that although their most obvious and immediate impacts is revenue collection, it is very surprising that in most of these countries reviewed, the funds raised with these schemes are not allocated to environmental protection or energy transition purposes, except in the case of Colombia and Costa Rica, that these funds were partially used for this kind of environmental purposes, but in most of them, they weren't. So they are not really being used as a mechanism to improve climate finance in our country. So those are some reflections I wanted to share from the experience in Latin America. I will share the link to the report, and I will be here for some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carola, and especially for sharing this report and maybe first giving this broader global look at the need for climate finance. So now maybe we can look over at the role of environmental taxation and climate justice in Africa. So Solomon, maybe could you share a bit about how the UN Tax Convention, especially we've seen some exciting progress happen this past summer or this past August with the adoption or the finalization and adoption of the frames of reference for the UN Tax Convention. And this was really spearheaded by the African group. So Solomon, what has been the role of African governments, African countries to lead on this? And could you share a bit about this? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexandra. I think one thing we just have to appreciate is that I think Africa has been on the receiving end when it comes to the impacts of climate change. We've seen recently, I can give you an example of Zambia. Currently, we are experiencing the drought situation, which has really affected the social and economic activities. Currently, as I'm talking to you, because of power outages, I'm using the phone. I can't use my laptop because it's dead. Yeah.
Sorry, it's cutting out a little bit.
Look at the financial flows. I think we've seen over time billions.
Okay, let's just see. when Solomon rejoins, I'll send a quick message. Maybe then in the meantime, if I could jump over to you, Markus, if you don't mind, if we do it like this, and then Solomon can resume his presentation when he joins back in. So if that's okay, Markus, could I ask you?
Totally.
Yeah, okay, great.
Yes, sure. Thank you.
What are some of the environmental tax justice principles? Kind of, could you describe what are they and how can they really be implemented? We're looking forward to hearing your perspective on this.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Pleased to be here with you today. I have indeed some thoughts to share with you on where we think tax and climate justice, environmental and tax justice go hand in hand. We spoke about it already. Lidy, Carola, we are meeting here today to bring together pay up and end fossil fuels. We've been speaking about and we heard about green taxes, progressive green tax in Latin America, which seem to be useful. And I would like to go a little bit, dig a little bit deeper to see what could be the conditions of really getting progressive environmental taxation right, just and fair. How could it look in practice, a practical example, and what would be the pathway to, speaking about global issues here, to get a global move towards fair environmental taxation. So some of the issues I want to raise were already brought up, namely what is really the basic principles to ensure climate and tax justice meet. And these are two principles you might have heard about because they are not so new. And this is about the common but differentiated responsibilities and the respective capabilities of countries to jointly act on the climate and environmental crisis. And this common but differentiated responsibilities acknowledges that global environmental issues we can only really tackle on a global level jointly. But there must be a differentiation in who acts, who is responsible to move first, to act bolder than the others. And this is very much acknowledging that countries have different capabilities, different economic, social situation to act at the level in which they can act, and that they have as well, historically, different responsibilities in addressing environmental challenges. We heard this from Lidy, those areas in the world, the global south, which are the least responsible for climate change and environmental degradation, they suffer the most currently, and we fear much more to come in the future. So again, common but differentiated responsibilities takes into account each country's specific circumstances, their role and their capacity and their ability to move in change in the system, in all the systems we've been talking about this year. This is the energy, this is the financial architecture, this is the just transition on all fronts. The second principle I would like to talk about, and we heard this as well already, it is the polluter pays principle, the idea that those companies, we would say, who are causing the solution and who are causing environmental damage, that they are responsible and need to act and need to pay for the damage they are causing. These are the two principles. How does this look now in reality? And this is, I'm now making the most famous environmental tax. This is the carbon pricing. This is the CO2. You heard about carbon taxation. In Europe, there's the European trading system. And here, from our point of view, it is well established that carbon pricing as the price on CO2 put to consumers, out to consumption, this is very often what we call a regressive tax structure. This means that those people with a lower income relatively pay more on these taxes than the well-off middle class or upper class. So this is the idea that carbon pricing very often hurts the more vulnerable people in society, because they have to pay a bigger burden, carry a bigger burden on this particular tax, as it is often just put on the prices of what we are consuming, be it fuel, be it transport, whatever. And in Europe, there is now a second element where we think that the justice, the fairness element of carbon pricing is not really clear. And this is the Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is the so-called CBAM, and the idea is that countries who want to import some heavy industry products, steel, iron, aluminium, energy, they have to pay a price for the carbon emission that were used by producing this. If they are lower, respectively, if they are non-existent, because the EU will have such a price. So this is the idea that you're having an entry tariff. If you haven't priced CO2 before, you will have to pay a fee when the products come. And here as well, we can tell that many countries who don't have the very much sophisticated industrial base, who have as well a higher CO2 intensity in their production, they will be punished, and their goods might have it more difficult to get into the European market. So what would be then a practical example where we, and Carola mentioned it, what would be progressive green taxation? And here you see something which really adds to it, points to it. This is where we think this is something which is less the case. It is indeed the fossil fuel industry who should directly pay. This is about pay up, but this is as well ending fossil fuels. We're speaking about taxing the profiteers and the polluters, thinking that indeed at the beginning, the original sin is digging it out, pumping it out, selling it for burning it. And here we see just simply that this industry is very healthy and very profitable. So you see just only 4 of those big companies, American, European, only the big crisis here, 150 billion, them alone. But again, so-called a bit of normalization, which is not true. We still have multiple crises going on. And the profits, 100 billion of those 4 only, are continuing very healthily. And this is not only a few companies, but it is the whole industry. For years and years. What you see here is the International Energy Agency, which is showing what is the net income. This is revenues minus operational costs before taxes. This is the money they are earning, right? And it is the thousands of billions year after year after year. The peak year 2022. And at the same time as well, they know that they are not really giving all they can to invest into the energy transition, into renewables. Their capital investments is minor compared to what they're still spending on the expansion of their business. So this makes us calling really when we have the polluter pays principle putting money of consumers who have to pay from their income, from their available money. We want to turn it around. We just say the fossil fuel industry is the major driver, the beginning of the climate crisis. And they're making very, very healthy profits ever since. And it seems like no crisis will hardly make them not making profits anymore. So we would think straightforward, an extra profit tax on the profits of the fossil fuel industry would be a way to combine polluter pays with progressive tax elements. And The good news is it is easy to tax the profits of the fossil fuel industry, technically. The European Union just did it 2 years ago. They decided that an extra 33% of an above average profit should be taxed. Tax administrations did it once, they did it twice for 2022 and 2023, whereas we don't have the final figures yet. It's like a healthy 18 billion, at least for 1 year. So in terms of compliance costs, it is everything in place. They could tax the profit of the fossil fuel industries extra tomorrow with 2 extra clicks. And we think as well, such a polluter pays profit tax surcharge has a transformational element because it tackles the business model of the industry. It would make the cost of capital higher. It would decrease the asset values, the values of their reserves. It makes them less profitable. We would then think money goes away, divestments from fossil fuels to different industries. And then, of course, we have as well additional tax revenues, which are so direly needed, as we learned easy. And we think as well that at the moment, while the EU did it, and it is still national policies and national governments to actually do it, looking at the illicit financial flows from the mining industry, oil and gas industries as well, this is tax evasion or tax avoidance, requires a global answer. And we have at the moment a process to develop a United Nations framework convention on tax cooperation. And here we see as well, as we discussed, that social, environmental, and economic policies, principles, areas need to be merged with the same value. So we think like getting this progressive environmental taxation coordinated on the higher level within the framework of the UN Tax Convention is a good opportunity to make the polluter pays principle fair and just according to the principles that we just established. And then we as well, within this process of a UN Tax Convention, we can expect and work for that an extra protocol on tax cooperation will see the day of the light once the process has started forward. So we think here this could be really a good place, this protocol at the United Nations on environmental challenges, that such a progressive polluter pays tax surcharge on the profit of the fossil fuel industry could be coordinated and at some point see the light as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus, for this presentation and also for the examples of how we can really actualize these environmental tax justice principles. I see that Solomon, you are back on, so let's see how your audio is doing if you'd like to give it a shot.
Hi, Alexandra. Can you get me?
It's still breaking in and out quite a bit.
Hello, can you get me?
Yes, we can hear you, but it's quite choppy. I'll turn off my video and see if that helps.
Oh, yeah, I think I can get you clearly. The impacts of climate change in Zambia. Can you get me clear now?
Yes, that's better for me now.
That's better. Yeah, I think just to be quick, the network is kind of bad because of the impact of climate change. Like I said, we've got challenges with the electricity now. I think we've been having almost a whole day without power. But going forward, like I've said, you can see in terms of the Zambia, or let's say Africa, being on the receiving end when it comes to climate change impacts, as well as illicit financial flows, where we are losing quite substantial amount of billions going out of Africa. So the international tax convention, I think, allows for an inclusive international tax cooperation that can help finance climate change just in general, as well as ensuring that climate obligations are met through effective tax mechanisms, as well as which also helps in terms of addressing the race to the bottom as a result of the rush for critical minerals. I can give an example like what is currently happening. We've seen that quite a number of investments are coming in rushing for these critical minerals to support the electrical car batteries. But going forward, what's in for us? Because already, like for Central Province, we've experienced the mining of manganese, where they're leaving huge ores and then cutting off trees. And then Central Province is an area which I think has been key when it comes to food security in the country. To be able to benefit in terms of taxation of such kind of investments. I think that's where we come in now from the African perspective or African governments. I think there's it also gives governments to enhance their legal frameworks when it comes to taxation, so that we can benefit and able to fund social services. Already the drought, the way it has impacted the country over time, we've seen that quite a number of households have been affected. I think over 116 districts in Zambia have been affected, and over 1 million plus have been affected because of the drought. Then how do we ensure that we are able to fend for these people? I think by developing progressive green taxes, I think it's an opportunity. The convention gives that opportunity to African countries like Zambia, as well as transparency. I think we've seen over time when it comes to the international tax architecture, we've seen that we have not really understood in terms of what is. It's an opportunity which gives African countries to have a say, as well as just having a voice to the global south. The convention gives a voice to the global south. I think those are some of the good things which we are seeing from the convention, as well as it would at the regional level. I think it's something which will also give an opportunity for engagement at the regional level. Seen COMESA, SADC. I think the UN Convention is something which we can take advantage as African countries to enhance a legal framework on taxation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hope you were able to get me clearly. Had to rush.
Yes, no, I think that was much clearer. So I appreciate that intervention. Now I just want to welcome participants to share some more questions in the chat. I think we can go ahead and get started with a few of them. If we'd like to jump into the Q&A, I also welcome our panelists if you have any reactions that you would like to give to each other's interventions. I know there's a lot to unpack with these topics. So maybe I'll start. We can give a question to Lidy. There's a question in the chat. Thank you for your insights. Our demands against global North governments are now clearer. Aside from progressive taxation and fiscal justice, what are other tax and climate finance demands we should raise towards governments in the global South? And then maybe I'll do a round of some of the other questions that we see. I think this one can go towards Markus. How can we ensure that the additional tax on fossil fuels will not increase the burden on individual customers who are already dealing with the cost of living crisis? I think really going to the heart of why we need tax justice in our climate policy. And we can start with these two.
Start with me, or who did you have in mind to go? Yeah, okay. So there's a specific question about what else are we going to make, what kind of other demands are we going to make with our global South governments as far as tax is concerned? Well, first of all, I think we need to challenge our global South governments to make our own national tax systems more progressive and more equitable. Because right now, And this is also a result of decades of a lot of international pressure, including from the IMF. You know, every decade, the IMF keeps pushing for more value-added taxes or increasing the percentage of value-added taxes, for instance. We need to make our tax systems more progressive so there's less burden on the poor, and then tax our rich more, tax our own elites in our own countries. But we should be also asking our own governments to stand firm and participate actively in the global processes and discourse that are calling for tax justice internationally in the tax systems. There's now a big movement and campaigns of different groups in the South as well as in the North, for instance, for pushing for wealth taxes, and not just in our own countries, but especially in the North, where the biggest number of the world's wealthiest live. And this is specifically one tax instrument or one tax policy that we are pushing in order to help raise the climate finance, for instance, that is needed. We should start first and foremost, for instance, with the trillion dollar earning fossil fuel corporations out there, and they should be properly taxed. So there's a whole host of demands that I know that from global to national that we need to advocate strongly for. But for the immediate issues that we want to raise with governments, especially during this week of the UNGA and the following week and the Summit of the Future, we need to have, if we can boil down to one single message, I think we should have tax justice in the form of stopping tax evasion and abuse by corporations and taxing the profiteers and the polluters so that they can deliver on their climate finance obligations, and stop all these incentives for fossil fuel companies that are just extending the life of the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you for that. Now, Markus, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you. Yes. First of all, there was a question about the data of the industry's net income. This is coming from the International Energy Agency, the 2023 World Investment Energy Investment Report. So and again, Lidy said it, right? What is the progressive element in environmental taxation? It is those trillions of net income of the fossil fuel industry, which they are cashing in year after year, despite the biggest crisis. And we know, in particular, this is the extractive industries in the global South, who's particular prone of not paying their fair share in taxes. So I think when it comes to tax justice and climate justice, it is those polluters who first of all have to pay their fair share of taxes. And to get this right is one challenge. The other challenge is indeed now how to make it progressive, how to charge consumers. And this is indeed the current paradigm based on the commodification of nature, where we think CO2 is just something we can make a new asset class, we trade it, we set it off, we tax it eventually with the hope that at some point consumers might make a different choice. This is the behavioral change element of this environmental taxation in the classic sense. But when you tax the profits, right, this is a supply side measure, whereas the conventional carbon tax has the same impact than consumption taxes. When we go after the profits, and again, this is what I mentioned to be the transformational element of such a tax, it directly gets at the core of the business model. When I have less profit, I'm probably less interested for the financial market. So it would be tackling the business from the other side, or the fossil fuel industry from the other side, not from the consumption side, that the consumers are held responsible to make the right choice It will just simply have the idea to drain away the financial resources of the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you. Lidy, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so I'd like to add and reinforce what Markus is saying about what's the difference between consumption taxes and profits. I mean, one of the important requirements, of course, here, because fossil fuel companies can cheat, right? We're supposed to be taxing their profits, but they might, as I think Adrian in the Q&A was saying, they might pass it on to the consumers in one form or the other. But we need to emphasize that we also need other mechanisms. We need to have very strict regulatory mechanisms and requirements for transparency. So for instance, there has to be very clear review of energy prices and see the structure of energy prices, the rates, what are the components of these rates, what are they charging us? Because then we can also examine whether they're passing off the taxation on their profits in one way or the other by, you know, trying to earn more profits than they should be earning and passing it on in the process. Because there's also laws that can be legislated, regulatory laws against what is called the pass-through, right? When you pass it on to the consumers. So there's a lot of other things other than tax policies that we should be looking at in terms of a package. And that is while we're still allowing them to operate as fossil fuel. Because the other thing that we should be doing is also pursuing the rapid phase out of these corporations and this industry, the fossil fuel industry. Of course, it cannot be just abrupt and sudden, because we need to also rapidly develop the renewable energy systems. We can't just phase out without any alternatives for people, for energy sources, right? That's why we're saying, even if we're emphasizing they should be phased out immediately, that immediacy is also has to be accompanied by the immediate building of renewable energy systems. So while they're still around, there has to be other regulatory measures so that they can be properly monitored and that they don't pass on these taxes to the consuming public, especially those who are already spending so much of their income and their wages just on energy, because that's one of the biggest cost of living expenses in the South, especially the electricity prices are horrendous. So I think that's a very important question.
Yes, definitely. And maybe I'll just jump over to another question in the chat before Carola has to pop off. I see there is a question on giving some examples of these green taxes, and if the revenue is not only used for environmental or climate policy, how is that allocated, and a bit more on that.
Yes, thank you so much. I replied in the Q&A section about the examples of these 5 countries and how they are using the green taxes for like carbon taxes, taxes to the fossil fuel, import and production. And I also mentioned some of the exceptions they do. For example, in Chile, they exempt the carbon taxes for new cars is there's an exception for public transport. So there are some considerations. And yeah, we were very surprised to see that these taxes are not, the revenues from these taxes are not being used in environmental activities. And there is a lot of potential to do that. So that's why we think green taxes should not only disincentivize the production and commercialization of fossil fuels, but they should also improve our collection of public money to invest in, for example, mitigation and adaptation measures in our countries, considering that international climate finance is completely insufficient and inefficient. So that's why we think they should be used there. And there was another question, I think, about how can they reach the people. I think they can be invested directly in some projects, but they can also maybe through national funds or different national mechanisms, they could be distributed to local stakeholders that are more vulnerable to climate change to help them improve their resilience and conditions. So I think, yeah, there is a lot of potential, but a lot of things to do. And we also, we analyze not only green taxes, but also the subsidies, what is happening in subsidies in our countries. And for example, in my country, the big agribusiness are being benefited because of the fossil fuel subsidies that the country has. So when we talk about progressive green taxes and progressive green mechanisms, tax mechanisms, I think we should also try to avoid this kind of benefiting the ones that are creating the problem. In my country, if you are trying to take out some subsidies, you should do it first in these kind of sectors that are harming, that are really creating more problems and impacts. And I'm sorry I will have to leave, but thank you so much for inviting me and for the attention.
Yes, thank you. And I think there's been a lot of really good points on the need for progressivity and how it's not just about taxation or just about climate action, but really the word justice is so key when we're talking about these issues and their connection. I also think there's a question in the Q&A about how this global north profiteering and the wealth really plays into these austerity dynamics. And maybe if either Markus, Solomon, Lidy, if either of you want to jump on that. If not, maybe I would say Lidy, if you would like to answer that. There's a few other questions in the chat, so we can also move on to those after.
I'd like to have the other speakers also have their time for the responses, so I give way.
Thank you. So I see here as well one comment on the question of the polluter pays in the global south. And I find this a very, very relevant question because just recently, I just today read an article that the WTO thinks a way to tackle the injustice in global carbon pricing with CBAM is to have carbon pricing everywhere. We know as well the IMF, the World Bank are very much in favor of having a carbon pricing applied globally. And again, as I mentioned, this seems to be part of the present prevailing economic paradigm. I would call this neoliberal. But as well, a very recent report just found out that carbon pricing, they were checking, I don't know how many, 67 different cases of successful climate policy. And indeed, they found out that carbon taxation often was part of a successful policy mix. Very important. Carbon taxation alone doesn't do the trick, right? We heard about Lidy and others speaking about having the carrots as well for the transition on renewables, on energy efficiency, on making production leaner, cleaner, lighter, less resource intensive, right? So part of a policy mix. And then they found us out as well, according to a theory of political intervention hierarchy, that in those countries which don't have established environmental or climate protection law and legislation, then one should be very careful with carbon pricing or with taxation policy, with market-based instruments, right? So, and I think this is something to think about of really if carbon pricing is something which is a one-size-fits-all approach, or if there shouldn't be really environmental taxation in this classical sense as taxing consumers, making consumers change their behavior. If there for global south countries on a case by case, if there shouldn't be other policy mixes who are prioritizing different measures, support measures for the alternatives, rather than putting a carbon pricing as a headline policy instrument first.
Thank you for that. And Solomon, if you'd like to jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to add on to what Markus has said, because already we've seen what is happening, like for Zambia, where these investors who are trading in carbon markets have taken advantage of the legal framework, because already we don't have a comprehensive legal framework on carbon markets. They're using under the RED Plus projects, they're taking advantage of that, where it's able to sell the carbon credits to international companies. One example I can give, I think in Eastern Province, it's Comaco, which is being supported by BP? Yeah, that is British Petroleum, which has been supporting the conservation project. But if I look at now, the amount of monies which go to the communities who are being told to involve in conservation and all, like you find we are not clear in terms of how much profit they made out of that. But if I to look at 19 chiefdoms, and then they got about $3.1 million. But the question which comes in is how much did they make in terms of the profits? So you can see when it comes to climate justice aspect, how do we ensure that local communities are protected from this, who are making profits from such kind of investments? I think, like I earlier said, there's need to enhance the legal framework, especially in developing countries, the South as well. I think that's where the problem has been.
Thank you for that. And I see there's some other questions in the chat, but I think in the interest of time, maybe we can just see if there's any final remarks from any of the panelists. And I know there's been a lot of great discussion, and there's definitely areas that we can continue this work and continue these conversations outside of this webinar. So if anyone has any final comments or reactions, please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so just looking at some of the concerns on the chat. Well, first of all, I think we need to reiterate that our ultimate aim with the fossil fuel industry is not just to tax them, but to really phase out the fossil fuel extraction, production, and consumption. And we have very little time to really get back on track with this, because the world was never on track to get on track with this, because what is really important at this point is not to talk about the lofty goals to be achieved by 2050, but what needs to be done in the near term, in the next 5 years. Otherwise, we'll lose whatever little chance we have in still achieving the Paris goal of keeping temperature rise below 1.5. But we're looking also at the immediacy of the need for climate finance. That's why we're looking at these tax measures. And we have no time, the world doesn't have any time for very incremental improvements on taxes. We really need major changes, shifts in tax policy so that we can raise these funds. I'd also like to emphasize that the funds are really important, that they're public. We can't be just bullied into relying on private sector finance and the markets, because if we do that, we will be completely lost, because the markets and the private sector do not have this sense of urgency and will not work by themselves in order to make the changes that we need to stop climate change. And then finally, just to say that ultimately, of course, the roots of climate change lies in the system. So all aspects of the system need to be changed so that we can eventually, solve it, eventually meaning in the short term, not too long. Not just the reasons for why there is global warming, but for the reasons why people are so vulnerable to its impact. So we need to do all these many changes, and the tax justice front is indeed very critical for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Markus, if you have any final sentences.
I think Lidy said it. We are on the Tax Justice Day, but of course it's the week of action, right? And I think every day has its own very relevant focus. It is about the different subsystems where we have to get into. I'm happy that today we were part of this bigger movement, which is much more transformational. than only the tax system.
Amazing. And Solomon, if you have any concluding remarks, please.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to the need to comprehensively enhance the legal framework, especially for the global south when it comes to tax system, climate financing. I think that's where the main gap is. The tax convention, I think, offers that opportunity to go down to at a country level, so that at the end of the day, the communities who tend to be impacted more by climate change are able to benefit adequately from the investments.
Thank you so much. And thank you both the panelists and our amazing interpreters and all the participants for this webinar. I think it's been a very fruitful discussion and looking forward to continuing this great work outside of the webinar. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.